Do you want to understand the potential of truly passive investing in business acquisitions? Let's walk through an example deal together, showcasing the ins and outs of smart investing in this space. In this video, we will delve into how the whole process works, from finding and negotiating, structuring, raising capital, management considerations, and how the business performed after the acquisition. Hi friends, I'm Cody Koch. If you're new here, I'm a 25-year veteran investor, trader, and business owner. On my channel, I like to talk about investing, trading, and business concepts. So let's get to the example deal. To make this more interesting and easier to visualize, I'm going to actually tell this as a story. I will actually bring you, the viewer, into the story as a passive investor, and I will be in the role as the lead investor in the story. Now, this hypothetical deal is based on real people, real events, and real deals that I have either seen personally or been involved with, but everything has been changed because of non-disclosure agreements, such as the names, the numbers I'm going to show you, locations, industry, and so forth. With that said, let's get to it. Now, this started a number of years ago. I started to look for bigger businesses to acquire. Buying bigger businesses is nearly always better. According to information I've seen in the banking industry, larger businesses typically have a much lower failure rate than smaller businesses. Now, I define larger businesses as businesses that make over $500,000 a year in earnings, or to be more precise, earnings before interest and taxes. Another reason bigger is better in the business acquisition world is because larger businesses can afford professional managements in place to oversee the business, and typically professional management is some of the best managers you can get. So after looking around for a while, I finally found a business to acquire. It was a 21 location barbershop chain called Hair's Johnny, located in Dallas, Texas. It was founded by John, who at the time was 76 years old. He'd started out as a barber at the age of 19, and over the years he had gone out on his own, started his own barbershop, and then eventually started to grow that business into multiple locations. He eventually grew it to over 300 employee operation, both part-time and full-time. At the time I met him, John had slowed down quite a bit, and his wife had recently fallen ill, and so for these reasons he had decided it was time for him to sell. Now, the way the business worked at the very top was John. John was the director of operations, or you could call him the CEO. He oversaw everything as the owner-manager. Right below him was a gentleman by the name of Frank. Frank at the time was about 48 years old. Frank would be considered kind of an assistant director of operations who was in charge of running the business when John was not available. Below Frank were sort of regional managers that were each responsible for overseeing a few shops. Each shop had kind of a supervising manager just overseeing the shop. Each shop had anywhere from 10 to 20 employees. Frank had been the assistant director now for about 5 years. He seemed very skilled and knowledgeable, and he wanted to stay on after the business was sold. Now, real quick, I'm going to show you the hypothetical financials of Hair's Johnny. This is the income statement and balance sheet. I've simplified them a great deal just to make it quick and easy to understand. Now, negotiations went pretty smoothly, as they usually do in business acquisitions. You do not want a contentious negotiation with a seller of a business because they have to help you transition into ownership role, so you have to be careful how you negotiate these kind of things. So it's typically very friendly. What John wanted is as much cash at closing as possible due to his circumstances, but because of that, he was willing to take a little bit of a lower price, and he was willing to work with us on terms. So the asking price for Hair's Johnny was $5.25 million, which worked out to be about 3.5 times earnings before interest and taxes. So terms are almost always more important than the price itself. As an example, imagine I agreed to pay you $1 billion for your car, but the terms of the deal is I'd pay you a penny per day until it was paid off. It would take billions of years for you to get your $1 billion, hence terms are more important than the price. So in the case of this deal, what ended up working out was we ended up going to a bank and getting an SBA-backed loan for 80% of the purchase price, or in this case, that's $4.2 million. At the time, it was set at 8% interest, paid out monthly over the next 10 years. I, as the lead investor in this deal, was required to personally guarantee all $4.2 million of the deal. So that means if it went badly, I would be on the hook for $4.2 million. Next was the seller note. Now, in this case, the bank required that the seller, in this case, John, carry back a percentage of the business as a seller note. In this case, John carried back 10% of the purchase price, which was $525,000, interest-free, and his note was set on standby until the SBA loan was fully paid off. So in other words, John would not receive any of that 10% until the SBA loan was paid off over the next 10 years. So John, or his estate, would receive the last $525,000 only after the bank loan was paid off. So the last 10% of the deal, or $525,000, is set up as preferred equity. This is where myself and my investors, you, would put in money in this particular deal. It's issued as a preferred equity position at 16% annual dividend. The reason the rate of return is so high is because this is a very leveraged deal. So the risk is notably higher on this deal because of the large amount of debt on the books. This is quite literally a leveraged buyout. And because of that, the rates of return can be higher, but the risks are also higher. So 16% annual dividend paid out quarterly into perpetuity for many years into the future. Now, the investors would be locked up for 8 years. In this case, you would not be able to sell your investment for 8 8 years. At the end of those 8 years, however, you have a choice. You can continually hold on to the position, enjoy that regular cash flow, or you can sell your position back to the company for the amount you originally invested. Or your third option is you can sell the investment to another investor who's very likely to be willing to pay significantly higher than what you paid for the investment originally. The reason they're likely to do that is at this point, after 8 years, the deal would mature quite a bit, the debt would be significantly less, and it's very likely somebody is willing to accept a much lower yield than 16%. So you may be able to sell it for double what you paid for it. An investor who purchased that would be able to get a steady 8% return on their money every year. So the upside is quite significant for you in this case in multiple ways. Now, this is one major reason why I enjoy private business acquisitions as an investing vehicle so much, is because on average you can have notably higher returns, more growth potential, with approximately the same amount of risk as you would have in other asset classes. Now, I need to say this, as an investor, you would not be responsible for any of the debt. So you're not responsible for any of the liability on the debt, nor any of the liability in management's decisions in the business. Your risk is only the amount of money you invested in the deal initially. An added benefit of being in a preferred equity position means that you get to step ahead of me in what's called cash flow waterfall. As money flows through the company from top to bottom, that means you are required by law to receive a full return on your investment. In other words, that means you must receive all of your dividend before the common shareholder, in this case me, would receive a single penny. Also, in the case of liquidation of a business, you're required by law to receive all of your capital back first before the common shareholder gets a single penny. So this kind of structure is very, very favorable for a passive investor. So this can significantly decrease your risk while increasing your returns at the same time. This is why it's known as preferred equity. You can actually have variations of structures of preferred equity. They're usually a special class of shares within C Corps. They can also be a special class of ownership within LLCs and so forth. So back to our example. If you invested $100,000 into this deal, you would have received $16,000 per year every year over the next 8 years, at which point you can continue to receive those returns, or you can go ahead and sell your position either back to the company or sell it to another investor potentially for a much higher price. All right, so let's get back to the deal. If it's the first time you've ever done it, getting an SBA loan is like getting a proctology exam. Tons of information is required. It takes a long time. In this case, it took about 90 days, partly because it took a little while to find a bank who would actually do this particular deal. For those of you who are not familiar, an SBA loan or Small Business Administration loan, it's sort of like the government co-signing for a particular business. In many cases, it varies a great deal from one bank to another. Some banks will loan on certain industries, let's say e-commerce. Other banks will have absolutely nothing to do with e-commerce, but they'll be very happy to loan on service-based businesses. Other banks don't even want to loan on either of these. They may want to loan on manufacturing businesses, for example. In any case, they all do try to use SBA loans within the United States, SBA-backed loans, because it significantly lowers the risk to the bank. In this case, I had to reach out to a large number of banks, probably 20 or so, and communicate with them, kind of get an idea what they're willing to do. I ended up wasting a few weeks with some people who said they could get the deal done, and they just kept asking for more documentation with no real progress. Eventually, I had a friend of mine recommend a particular banker who was known and had a reputation, was very good at getting SBA loans relatively quickly. After I contacted him, everything started running quite a bit smoothly, and with about 3 weeks after contacting him, of course, I had all the financials already in place. He was able to get the loan within about 3 to 4 weeks. Now, as I said, the seller note was a bit of a requirement by the bank. John was willing to do the seller note. It was only 10% because, quite frankly, he was going to receive 90% of the cash at closing. Now, sometimes sellers actually want much more seller financing because the payment over time, it actually lowers their tax bite. For example, if somebody bought a business in California and paid $1 million, it's perfectly possible that the seller of the business may pay up to $600,000, $650,000 in taxes. For example, state, federal, local taxes all combined. Whereas if they sold that business and was paid out over the next 20 years, $50,000 a year, they may only pay about $350,000 of that in taxes. So the timing of how a seller is paid over time can have a significant effect on how much cash the seller is actually going to get to keep after taxes. In this case, since John was so worried about his wife and his own health so much, he wanted to get as much cash up front as he could and basically retire for the rest of his life. Now, raising money from investors is quite a bit tricky. It's actually quite difficult, especially if you've never done it before. It's a long, arduous process and can take, in many cases, years to do, especially for startup businesses and various things like that. For business acquisitions, a little bit easier to raise capital, but even then it can still be quite difficult because investors are very picky about the industries they will invest in. I utilized two major methods in this case to raise the capital. The first is I posted a deal on Facebook, so I actually advertised the deal on Facebook. Now, by doing this was a 506c money raise. That means that I'm only allowed to have accredited investors. And that by law, unfortunately, means that only wealthy people are essentially able to invest in a deal like this. But it did allow me to advertise on Facebook this particular deal. So I could advertise a little bit of the details, what kind of returns they can make, and a small percentage of people reached out and were interested in looking at this deal further or any more deals I have in the future. The second way I raised capital is I started with a big list of potential investors. Now, this big list is sometimes you have to buy it, sometimes you can go scrounge up these lists from various places. A lot of people hide their lists because the more people are aware of these lists, the less value these lists usually have, because the people on these lists start to get completely inundated with potential deals and it kind of drives them nuts. So you start with a big list of potential investors, and then I reached out to them deal by deal. In most cases, I sent them an email, a teaser email, and just sent it out to them and said, hey, here's what we got going on. Would you be interested? Small percentage said, yes, I'm interested in that. And I showed them a pitch deck, sent them a presentation video, a pre-recorded presentation video link, and in which they could watch the deal, and a few called me up. Out of about 600 people I originally sent an email to on this deal, I ended up speaking to maybe about 50 of them or so, 50, 60 of them. I actually spoke to, 5 actually invested. So we're gonna say that you were one of these investors. You either saw it on Facebook or you got an email from me. Either case, you talked to me, we went over the deal real quick. You didn't even have to leave your house. You in fact could have sat there at your laptop and looked at all the documentation, see the presentation, all the legal documentation, everything put together by the lawyers, and you'd have been able to make a decision relatively quickly to do the deal. So there's an interesting irony to this a little bit, is the people who are most likely to invest are actually the ones that are the quickest to make the decision early on. For example, all the ones that invested only needed to talk on the phone for maybe 15 minutes before they were pretty comfortable with the deal. Of course, they knew we had lawyers involved and escrow accounts and banks and all kinds of people involved in the deal, so they had a lot of confidence in it. And they were also successful businessmen in their own right, and so they had already had a lot of experience in this kind of stuff. Whereas on the other hand, I talked to some people for over the course of several weeks. I spoke to them for several hours each, and they actually never invested. For some reason, they never quite got comfortable with the deal. They wanted to talk about it a lot. They were trying to get comfortable with it. Were never quite there. And so it's just very interesting to observe how some can talk to you for less than 15 minutes and get very comfortable with the deal. Others can talk to you for several hours and never be comfortable with the deal. If you're enjoying this video, please hit that like button and subscribe. So while I was over here raising money from banks and investors, we were also doing due diligence. Fortunately, I have a financial analyst I've hired. He's got a history as an accountant, and he's done a lot of work as an auditor. He was helping me do the due diligence to basically verify all the numbers and all the facts we were seeing from the company were correct. We were going, of course, looking through the financial statements, the tax returns, the bank accounts, the credit card statements, everything we can find to verify all the numbers we were seeing were correct. And in this case, we actually had 2 lawyers working at the same time. One lawyer was working on the deal itself. The other lawyer was a securities lawyer who was helping me do the legal work required to raise capital from investors. So I'm going to give you a brief 5-part business plan I had for this business. And so number 1 on that list is maintain the status quo within the business. In other words, you want to change as little about the business as possible. In my experience, things I've learned over the years is that when you acquire a business that's successful, it's profitable, going in and changing stuff is usually worse for the business than it is good for the business. And so it's kind of equivalent to buying a brand new car. You buy a new car, you open up the hood and start pulling parts out and replacing those parts. Probably a bad idea. If you're changing things, the chances are you're probably going to harm it. It's the same in businesses. If you go in there and start changing a lot of stuff, it usually harms the business. So first goal was to change nothing about the business for at least the first year until I fully knew and understood every nook and cranny about the business. The second part of the plan was to promote Frank into the top position as a director of operations to replace John when John leaves. The third part of the plan, as Frank gets promoted, to hire somebody into the second assistant director position underneath Frank. This person's job is to help Frank manage the business. The fourth part of this plan is to have this assistant director trained up within 6 to 9 months to be able to take over as the top director of operations in case Frank leaves or gets hit by a bus. And the fifth part of this plan is, due to all the debt on the business's books, growth and trying to grow the business is kind of difficult. Generally, when you're in heavy debt like this, you're better off focusing on paying off that debt, lowering costs, rather than focusing on growing, because growth requires more cash and can often eat up more capital. If instead you're focused on reducing debt and making things more efficient, generally speaking, that's a better idea. Okay, with all that in place, here's what happened. We got through the legal work, the financial work was put together. There was a big escrow account controlled by the bank who was doing the SBA loan, as well as controlled by the lawyers. And so this escrow account, the bank started to fund, the investors started to fund. There was a very hard deadline for everybody, especially the investors had to have their money in by a certain date. Once all the money went to the escrow accounts, the banks and the lawyers and seller, investors, everybody was involved. In some cases, the investors had their lawyers involved. All the money went in, all the documents were signed, hands were shook, and the deal was done. Now here comes the most important part. Now that was all part of the transaction structure itself, which is often very interesting to everybody, but actually the most important part about buying a business is how you manage it after the fact. By far the most important part. So after it was done, I ended up traveling to Dallas, and I spent a few months down there traveling among the different shops, getting to know all the staff, getting to know all the management team, and really spending a lot of time mastering and understanding all the different processes within the business. Within about a month, we had hired a new assistant director director, as planned, who we promoted from within the business to work underneath Frank. And as planned, James immediately began the training for taking over the director of operations position, in case something happened to Frank. Okay, with all that done and the story sold, here are the results of what happened after the deal was completed. So everything ran smooth for about 2 years, and then one of our locations, actually road construction, started out front of the shop, and this hit our walk-in traffic a great deal. The road construction made it very difficult to get to the shop, so unfortunately the walk-in basically died, and this shop a significant decline in revenues and new business that would kind of form over time. So since the revenue declined significantly and the road construction was likely to go on for at least a few years, we actually started looking for another location for this shop. We found one and we moved it over to that location nearby, so it didn't really change a lot for our long-term customers, and we did find when we did this, it notably increased our walk-in traffic to the barbershop. Now, after 3 years, Frank's employment contract was up. He had decided at this point it was time to move on. He actually had found another position as a chief operating officer for a notably larger company. He was promised a salary that would allow him to get paid quite a bit more than what we were willing and able to pay him, so he went ahead and left. Plus, he was very bored. He'd been managing the barbershop chain for quite a while at this point, so he was kind of done and ready to go on another adventure. Fortunately, it wasn't in the same industry. It was in a different industry, and so it really wasn't affecting our business at all. So as planned, we promoted James into the director of operations position, and he is doing a good job. So shortly after James took over as director of operations, we hired Alex as the assistant director once again, and within 6 to 9 months, we had Alex trained up to take over the top position as well, just like we had done previously with James. And so far, they're all doing well. Then, of course, COVID hit, and like all barbershops and hair salon chains everywhere, we were required to shut down by the government for a while. We had pretty big expenses, as you can imagine, as you saw in our financial statements every month. Our monthly expenses were almost $1 million, so we were pretty worried about this. But fortunately, we had already accumulated enough cash, as our plan was to accumulate cash and pay off debt. SBA rules also changed quite abruptly because the government had shut everybody down. The SBA changed its rules on payments, and for a while they deferred those payments, or rather the SBA, I guess, technically paid some of these payments for us. While we were shut down by government decree, we did not have to make payments to the SBA, which basically saved us. Once everything opened back up, the revenue came back pretty quickly. We were able to start making payments again on the SBA loan. Because we built up that capital reserve, you and the other investors have never missed a payment. So now it's been about 7 years since you invested your capital in the deal. You and other investors put in $525,000 total. Over that time, you guys have received $588,000 in dividends, and you still own your positions, which are worth anywhere from $525,000 at least up to a little over $1 million in value. So you've at least doubled your money and very possibly tripled your money in 7 years. So there you have it. That hypothetical deal, that's what it looks like. That's how it's all structured. So this gives you a little bit of an idea what this journey is like, and it's kind of interesting and unique if you've never gone through it before. Now, there are some people who are going to ask, well, where do I find deals like that? And it's a great question. The answer is that generally you want to look for syndication deals. A lot of the time you'll find them with real estate syndications. You can find them with oil and gas syndications. You can find them on water well syndications. Startup business syndications called angel syndications, where they bring all their money together and they pool their money and invest in a startup. If you are interested in learning about business acquisitions like the example I've given you today, you can go to ironoakcapitalpartners.com. If you sign up there, you can actually look at deals from time to time that go through there. Now, in this video, I've described how you can passively invest in private business acquisitions and possibly get returns up to 16% per year. However, I recently did a video detailing a few strategies that can make up to 18% per year in publicly traded stocks, and you can watch that video here. Now, if you've really enjoyed this video, please let me know by hitting that like button and subscribing. It assures me that I'm doing the right thing and I should continue doing stuff like this in the future. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.